The air in Havenwood had grown teeth. November was not a month for mercy, but a season of judgment, and its verdict had been delivered upon Mara and her mother. They stood before the town hall, a pair of stark figures against the bruised twilight sky, the collective gaze of the community a physical weight upon their shoulders. Mara, at 25, possessed the hollowed-out stillness of a bell that had been rung too hard and too long, her widow's weeds the same shade as the encroaching night. Beside her, Lena, her mother of 70 years, leaned heavily on a worn hickory walking stick, her bad leg a cruel anchor in the frozen mud of the street. Their belongings were a pathetic mound on a handcart, 2 threadbare blankets, a sack of potatoes, a cast-iron pot, and a single crate of preserved apples, the last vestiges of a summer that felt a lifetime ago. Master Borin, the town's foremost builder and a man whose certainty was as solid as the foundations he laid, stood as the embodiment of the town's will. His beard was a formidable frost-dusted shield, and his eyes held no malice, only the cold pragmatism of survival. "The council is not without sympathy, Mara," he stated, his voice a low rumble that carried easily in the thin, frigid air. "But the debt from your husband's passing remains. The room at the inn cannot be given for charity. Every mouth must be fed by the hands that work, and every hearth must be stoked by the wood that is chopped. It is the law of the mountain. It was a law written not in books but in the rings of felled trees and the headstones in the churchyard." Mara said nothing. Words were a currency she could not afford to spend. She simply looked at him, her gaze clear and unwavering, an act of defiance that unsettled the crowd more than any plea would have. She had begged, weeks ago. She had offered to work, to mend, to cook, to clean. But in a town where every woman was already adept at such things, her labor had no market. They were deemed a burden, 2 more souls to strain the finite resources of a settlement bracing for the siege of winter. A woman in the crowd, her face pinched with a mixture of pity and fear, pulled her shawl tighter. "Where will they go?" she whispered, the question dissolving into a puff of white vapor. Borin's gaze shifted to the towering peaks that loomed over the valley, their granite faces already plastered with snow. "The mountain provides for those who are strong enough to take it." It was a dismissal, a casting out into the wilderness that was, in its own quiet way, a death sentence. Mara adjusted the thin shawl around her mother's stooped shoulders. She gripped the handle of the cart, the raw wood biting into her cold-numbed hands. The wheels groaned in the ruts of the road as she pulled, turning her back on the only home she had ever known. Lena took a pained step, then another, the tip of her stick sinking into the unforgiving earth. They moved away from the clustered, firelit windows of Havenwood, walking toward the great and terrible darkness that waited to swallow them whole. The path out of the valley was a wound carved into the land, and with every upward step, the wind grew more malevolent. It was a predator, stalking them through the skeletal branches of aspen and pine, stealing the meager warmth from their bodies. Lena's breath came in ragged, painful gasps, each one a small cloud of her fading vitality. The hickory stick, her third leg, became an enemy, slipping on icy patches of rock and sinking into drifts of early snow. After what felt like an eternity of struggle, with the lights of Havenwood long since vanished behind them, Lena stumbled, her bad leg giving way completely. She collapsed beside the trail, a crumpled heap of wool and despair. "I cannot, Mara," she wept, her voice thin and brittle as a dead leaf. "I cannot go on. Leave me here." Mara knelt beside her, her own exhaustion a leaden cloak. Desperation was a cold, sharp thing in her throat. Leaving her mother was unthinkable, yet moving her seemed impossible. She looked around at the hostile wilderness, the looming shadows of the cliffs, the indifferent stars beginning to prick the deep indigo sky. It was in that moment of absolute hopelessness that she saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible trail branching off the main path, one so old and overgrown it was little more than a suggestion. It led steeply upwards, toward a sheer rock face. It was not a path of logic, but of last resort. With a strength born of pure necessity, she helped her mother to her feet, half carrying her as they scrambled up the forgotten track. The trail ended abruptly at a wall of granite, and for a heart-stopping moment, Mara thought it was a dead end. But then, tucked behind a curtain of withered, frozen vines, she saw a dark rectangle, a low, heavy door of weathered planks. It was the entrance to an abandoned cellar, a root cellar perhaps, dug into the mountain itself. The door was not locked. It groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a space of profound blackness that smelled of damp earth and time. It was a tomb. But it was a tomb out of the wind. Inside, their eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom, they found a small, stone-lined room. It was cold, empty, save for a few rotting wooden crates in the corner. As Mara broke one apart for kindling, her fingers brushed against something solid and smooth tucked away in the debris. She pulled it out. It was a small book, its leather cover warped and stained, but its pages, protected by the dry dark, were largely intact. She recognized the spidery, precise handwriting at once. It was her grandfather's journal. He had been a stonemason, a man considered peculiar by the townsfolk for his strange ideas about heat and stone and air. He had died long ago, his theories dismissed as the ramblings of an eccentric. Mara opened the journal, and in the flickering light of a small tallow lamp, she saw not just words, but diagrams, intricate drawings of channels and chambers, and a single, recurring phrase underlined for emphasis: the smoke must pay its rent before it is allowed to leave. In the cold, dark silence of their new, subterranean home, a fragile spark of an idea began to glow within her. The days that followed were a blur of relentless labor. While Lena rested, her body slowly recovering in the relative shelter of the cellar, Mara worked. Her first task was to make the space secure. Using mud mixed with dried grasses and her own hands, she chinked every crack in the stone walls and meticulously sealed the heavy wooden door, creating an almost airtight chamber. The only opening she left was a small, high vent that could be plugged with a bundle of rags. Then, her true work began, guided by the cryptic diagrams in her grandfather's journal. She was not building a fireplace. The people of Havenwood would not have even recognized the structure taking shape in the center of the cellar. A traditional hearth was a gaping mouth, built for spectacle, for the greedy consumption of wood and the cheerful, dancing flames that hypnotized the eye while sending 90% of their heat straight up the chimney to be lost to the sky. Mara's construction was the opposite. It was a closed, hulking thing, built with purpose and quiet intelligence. She used flat stones she prized from the mountainside and a mortar of clay, sand, and water. It rose slowly, a solid, rectangular mass of rock and earth, with a small, iron-doored firebox at its base and a clean-out port near the floor. It looked less like a source of heat and more like a stone sarcophagus. Her work did not go unnoticed. A pair of hunters from Havenwood, tracking a stag high on the ridges, stumbled upon her strange hermitage. They saw her, face and hands smeared with mud, hauling stones like a beast of burden. They peered into the cellar and saw the bizarre earthen altar she was building. Word traveled back to the valley on whispers of pity and ridicule. "The widow's gone mad with grief," they said at the town tavern. "Building a mud pile in a cave. She'll freeze before the first true snows." The talk eventually reached Master Borin. His professional pride piqued by the notion of such an unorthodox construction, he made the arduous journey up the mountain himself. He found Mara fitting the final capstones onto her creation. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the entrance, casting a long shadow into the cellar. He surveyed the cramped space, his gaze falling on the squat, graceless mass of stone. He kicked it lightly with his boot. It was solid, unyielding. "What is this foolishness?" he asked, his tone not cruel, but profoundly dismissive. "A tomb for your fire?" "A mud and stone coffin." Mara rose, wiping her hands on her worn skirt. "It is a heater," she said, her voice even. Borin let out a short, humorless laugh. "Child, I have built every worthwhile structure in this valley. I have built lodges that can withstand the worst the mountain can throw at us. I know fire, and I know stone. That thing will give you no more warmth than a dying candle. You need a proper hearth, a great fire that roars. You need to fight the cold with heat, not trap it in a pile of rocks." He gestured to the vast, cold wilderness outside. "That is your enemy. It is a beast that must be met with a greater beast. Your little toy will be its first meal." He turned to leave, his duty as a concerned elder apparently done. "Come back to the valley," he offered, a final, perfunctory gesture of charity. "Beg the council's forgiveness. Better to be a servant in a warm house than a queen in a frozen grave." Mara watched him go, his words echoing in the silent cellar. She looked at her finished work. It was ugly, brutish, and utterly devoid of the romantic charm of a crackling fireplace. But she trusted the faded ink in her grandfather's journal more than she trusted the confident pronouncements of Master Borin. She trusted the quiet logic of the diagrams. She had built her strange, silent engine of survival, and now, all she could do was wait for the cold to put it to the test. To understand what Mara had built, and why the master builder of Havenwood was so disastrously wrong, one must first understand the profound inefficiency of the very thing he championed. The open fireplace, for all its romantic allure and its cheerful, dancing light, is a thermal catastrophe. It is a monument to waste. Its function is simple: burn fuel in an open chamber and let the heat radiate into the room. However, the vast majority of that heat, carried by the hot air and smoke, rushes directly up the chimney, warming nothing but the indifferent winter sky. Worse, this powerful upward draft, known as the stack effect, creates a vacuum in the house. To fill that vacuum, the structure actively sucks in cold air from the outside through every crack, every gap in the floorboards, every poorly sealed window frame. The more furiously the fire burns, the stronger the draft becomes, and the more frigid air it pulls into the room. The inhabitants find themselves in a paradoxical struggle: their faces scorch while their backs freeze. They are forced to burn enormous quantities of wood simply to counteract the cold being drawn in by the fire meant to warm them. It is a cycle of immense effort for diminishing returns, a brute force battle against physics that can never truly be won. Mara's creation, learned from the pages of her grandfather's lost wisdom, was not a fireplace. It was a masonry heater, a device born from a completely different philosophy. It was not about fighting the cold, it was about intelligently managing heat. The core principle was thermal mass. The heater was a heavy, dense block of stone and clay, designed to act as a heat battery. The small, iron-doored firebox at its base was for a fast, hot, and remarkably brief fire. But the genius of the design lay in what happened to the smoke and hot gases produced by that fire. Instead of a direct path to the sky, the gases were forced on a long, convoluted journey. Inside the heater's massive body was a labyrinth of channels, a series of horizontal and vertical passages that snaked back and forth. The smoke, in the words of Mara's grandfather, was forced to pay its rent as the superheated gases navigated this maze. They were slowed down, their intense heat transferring directly into the stone and clay mass through the process of conduction. By the time the gases finally reached the exit flue, they were cool enough that one could comfortably hold a hand over the opening. The heat had been captured, stored within the very bones of the heater. Once the fire was out and the flue was closed, the second phase began. The heater, now saturated with thermal energy, started to release it. But it did not release it as a blast of hot air. Instead, it radiated gentle, consistent, far-infrared heat, the same kind of heat you feel from the sun on a cool day. This warmth traveled in straight lines, heating objects directly: the walls, the floor, the furniture, the people, rather than just the air. The result was a profound, bone-deep warmth that was even and silent, with no drafts and no cold spots. A single, small, hot fire lasting only 2 hours could charge the thermal mass enough to radiate heat for the next 12, or even 24, hours. It was the epitome of efficiency, a quiet servant that used a mere fraction of the wood an open fireplace would devour, all while providing a superior and more comfortable quality of heat. It was intellect over brute force, a partnership with thermodynamics rather than a war against it. It was a silent, stone lung, breathing warmth into the small cellar, a secret that Havenwood had long forgotten. The sky began to curdle. For days, it had been a hard, metallic grey, but now it took on a bruised, yellowish tint that spoke of violence to come. The wind, which had been a constant harasser, fell eerily silent, a predator holding its breath before the final lunge. The old trappers in Havenwood sniffed the air, checked the behavior of the jays, and declared that this would be no ordinary storm. This was the White Death, a blizzard of legend that swept down from the northern peaks perhaps once a generation, a storm that buried cabins, suffocated livestock, and remade the landscape. A frantic energy seized the town. The rhythmic thud of axes echoed through the valley as men worked feverishly to split and stack the last of their wood piles, creating small mountains of fuel beside every door. Women hurried to bring in the last of the root vegetables from their garden cellars, checking the seals on their preserves, their faces tight with anxiety. Master Borin moved through the town with an air of grim authority, inspecting the joints of the log cabins he had built, ordering men to nail extra planks over windows and stuff rags into the gaps between the logs. His own home, the grandest lodge in the settlement, stood as a testament to his craft, a fortress of thick, interlocking timbers with a massive fieldstone chimney at its heart. He felt the familiar pride of a creator confident in his creation. He had built for this. His lodge would stand. High above, in the silent cellar, Mara's preparations were of a different nature. She had already gathered what she could, her small hoard of potatoes and apples and dried herbs neatly arranged on stone shelves. Her final task was to tend to her heater. She opened the small iron door of the firebox and loaded it with a carefully arranged bundle of dry wood, far less than a single armload for a conventional hearth. She lit it. The fire caught quickly in the enclosed space, roaring to life with an intensity that was almost frightening. For 2 hours, the fire burned with ferocious heat, the sound a low hum within the stone mass. Then, as the wood turned to glowing embers, she sealed the firebox door and closed the flue damper, trapping the last of the heat within. The roaring stopped. A profound silence fell over the cellar, broken only by the soft breathing of her mother. There was no visible fire, no crackling flame. There was only the quiet, immense warmth that had begun to seep from the stone. The first snowflake fell, then another, then 1,000. The wind returned, not as a stalker but as a screaming horde. The world outside the cellar dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. In Havenwood, the first howls of the wind were met with defiant shouts as men stoked their fires, determined to fight the beast head-on. They looked up towards the high cliffs, hidden now by the tempest, and a collective thought of pity passed through the town for the foolish widow and her mother, alone in their cold mountain tomb. The great test had begun. The blizzard was not a storm, it was an invading army. The wind clawed at the walls of Havenwood, a physical force that sought every weakness, every chink in the armor of the settlement. It screamed down the massive stone chimneys, forcing plumes of smoke back into the rooms and driving the cold in with it. Inside Master Borin's grand lodge, the scene was one of frantic, failing effort. The magnificent fireplace, large enough to roast an ox, consumed logs at a terrifying rate. Yet the room grew colder. The immense draft it created was its own undoing, pulling frigid, sub-zero air through the floorboards and rattling the window frames. The men and women huddled near the hearth were trapped in a cruel paradox, their faces flushed with heat while their backs felt the icy touch of the drafts a few feet away. The roaring fire, the very symbol of their defiance against the cold, had become their enemy's greatest ally, an engine pumping the life-draining chill into the heart of their fortress. Borin, his face grim and streaked with soot, watched the woodpile diminish with alarming speed. His masterpiece, his fortress of timber, was failing. The logs he had so perfectly scribed and fitted were contracting in the extreme cold, opening up minuscule gaps for the wind to exploit. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of fear. The battle was being lost. 600 feet above, in the mountain's embrace, there was no battle. There was only peace. The cellar, buried under a deep and growing blanket of insulating snow, was entirely shielded from the wind's fury. Not a single whisper of the gale penetrated its stone walls. Inside, the air was still, quiet, and suffused with a gentle, pervasive warmth. The masonry heater, its small fire long since extinguished, was a silent radiator, a solid block of captured summer. Mara and Lena sat at a small wooden table, eating a simple meal of baked potatoes and dried apples. The heat was not the scorching, aggressive heat of a fire, but a deep, resonant warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stones around them. It was the warmth of the earth itself. Lena, who had spent the last week shivering under blankets, had a touch of color back in her cheeks. She wore only a simple woolen dress, no shawl needed. "It feels alive," she murmured, placing a hand on the side of the heater. The stone was not hot to the touch, but deeply, wonderfully warm, like a sun-baked rock on a perfect afternoon. Mara nodded, listening to the profound silence. There were no drafts. There was no smoke. There was no frantic consumption of fuel. Their small store of wood, which would have lasted less than a single night in a conventional fireplace, would be enough to keep them warm for weeks. While the people of Havenwood fought a desperate, losing war against the cold, burning through their resources in a panic, Mara and her mother rested in the calm, warm heart of the storm. They were not surviving the blizzard, they were living through it, untouched. The great failure of the conventional way, the way of brute force and waste, was unfolding in chaos and fear down in the valley. And the quiet, humble success of a forgotten wisdom was proving itself in the unassailable tranquility of the mountain cellar. The irony was as vast and as cold as the storm itself. The fortress had become a trap. The tomb had become a sanctuary. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights, an unrelenting siege that broke the spirit of Havenwood. When the wind finally fell and a weak, watery sun illuminated the aftermath, the valley was transformed into a white desert of immense drifts and sculpted ice. The cost had been severe. 2 elderly residents had succumbed to the cold in their own homes, their fires unable to combat the insidious chill. Livestock had frozen in the barns. And the town's wood supply was critically, terrifyingly low. A profound sense of vulnerability had replaced their frontier pride. As soon as it was possible, a party of men, their faces gaunt and etched with exhaustion, assembled to make the ascent. Master Borin led them. It was not a mission of rescue, but of recovery. No one believed for a second that the widow and her mother could have survived. They carried shovels and blankets to wrap the frozen bodies, their steps heavy with grim duty. The journey was a brutal struggle against the transformed landscape, forcing them to dig through drifts as tall as a man. It took them half a day to reach the cliff face where the cellar was hidden. They found it completely buried, a smooth, featureless mound of snow. There was no sign of life. "Here," Borin said, his voice hoarse and pointed. "Dig here." The men set to work, their shovels biting into the dense, wind-packed snow. The labor was hard, and the air was thin and bitingly cold. As they dug deeper, they expected to find the door smashed in, the interior filled with snow. Finally, the top of the wooden door was exposed. Using a pry bar, they forced it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. They braced themselves for the sight of death. Instead, they were met by a gentle, rolling wave of warm air. It washed over their frost-bitten faces, a physical shock of comfort so profound it made them stagger. They peered into the dim interior. And they saw them. Mara and Lena were sitting at their small table, mending a blanket. A single lamp cast a soft glow on the scene. They were unharmed, calm, and looked up with mild surprise at the snow-caked figures who had broken into their home. The men stared, uncomprehending. The cellar was warmer than their own homes had been at the height of the storm. Their eyes darted around the small space, seeking the source. They saw no fire, no glowing embers, no smoke. They saw only the strange, squat altar of stone in the center of the room. Borin, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew, pushed past his men and stumbled into the cellar. He walked numbly towards the masonry heater. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat against the stone. It was warm. A deep, living warmth that pulsed with stored energy. He looked from the heater to Mara, his eyes wide with a question that his voice could not yet form. His authority, his certainty, the very foundation of his life's work, had crumbled to dust in the face of this warm, silent stone. Mara rose, her expression unreadable. She did not gloat or offer a single word of reproach. She simply ladled some warm broth from a pot sitting on the heater's surface into 2 bowls. She handed one to Borin. He took it, his hand shaking. He looked down at the steam rising from the bowl, then back at the impossible source of its heat. Finally, he found his voice. It was a broken whisper, the sound of a proud man shattered. "How?" The question hung in the warm air of the cellar, heavy with the weight of shattered pride and dawning wonder. "How?" Master Borin asked again, and this time it was not a demand, but a plea. In that moment, the roles were irrevocably reversed. The master builder had become the apprentice, the outcast had become the teacher. Mara did not answer with words at first. She simply retrieved her grandfather's journal from its protected niche. She opened it on the table, its pages filled with the elegant, precise diagrams and the spidery script of a man long dead. Borin leaned over it, his eyes tracing the lines that depicted the labyrinthine flue channels, the carefully calculated mass, the principles of heat exchange. He saw the notes in the margins, the mathematical formulas, the passionate insistence on efficiency and storage over brute force and spectacle. It was a language of physics and stone that he understood, yet it was arranged in a grammar he had never known. He became Mara's most devoted student. The following week, he returned not with shovels, but with his best stonemasons and his finest tools. He brought clay from the riverbank and sand from the quarry. Under Mara's quiet guidance, they dismantled a section of the heater so Borin could see its inner workings firsthand, the complex web of channels that forced the smoke to surrender its warmth. He touched the soot-lined passages, marveling at the simple genius of it. Then, they rebuilt it, and Borin's hands, accustomed to the grand scale of lodges and halls, learned the humble, meticulous craft of the heater. His first project upon returning to Havenwood was in the home of the two souls who had perished in the storm, as a memorial and a promise. He tore out the inefficient, smoke-stained fireplace with his own hands. The townsfolk watched, a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope in their eyes. They saw their proudest builder humbling himself, taking instruction from the young widow they had cast out. They saw him mixing mud and clay, fitting stones not for a grand facade, but for a dense, unlovely core. When the first masonry heater in Havenwood was complete, he lit its first fire himself. He showed the family how to burn it hot and fast, how to close the damper, and then they all waited. As the hours passed and the fire died but the warmth grew, spreading silently through the small cabin, a sense of awe began to replace the doubt. One by one, the families of Havenwood came to Mara and Borin. The sound of axes on wood was replaced by the chip of masons' hammers and the squelch of wet clay. They built heaters in every home, each one a monument to the new wisdom. The community was transformed not just physically, but spiritually. They learned that survival was not about the size of the fire but the intelligence of its use. They learned that the most powerful solutions are often quiet, humble, and patient. Mara was no longer an outcast. She was the keeper of the flame, the woman who had brought the warmth back to Havenwood, not with a roaring blaze, but with a forgotten secret whispered from the past. The valley prepared for the next winter not with fear and frantic labor, but with a quiet confidence, their homes now centered around the silent, breathing hearts of stone. There is a peculiar arrogance in the present moment, a belief that our solutions are the final, most evolved versions. We stand on a mountain of accumulated knowledge and often forget to look down at the foundations, at the ideas that were discarded not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient, or unfashionable, or simply misunderstood. Wisdom, like a rich vein of ore, does not always lie on the surface. Sometimes it is buried deep, hidden in the past, dismissed as the eccentric ramblings of a forgotten generation. It lies dormant in old books, in the faded memories of our elders, in the very earth beneath our feet, waiting for a desperate hand or a humble heart to uncover it. Havenwood believed in the roaring fire. It was their tradition, their culture, their symbol of strength and defiance against the wilderness. The fire was loud, it was dramatic, it was visible. It was a comforting spectacle. Their mistake was in confusing the spectacle of heat with the substance of warmth. They poured their energy, their forests, and their very lives into a grand, wasteful performance, all while a quieter, more profound truth lay hidden in a cellar on the mountainside. The masonry heater was not a new invention, it was an old one, a piece of ancestral knowledge that had been lost to the allure of the bigger, faster, and more impressive. Its victory was not just a triumph of thermodynamics, but a moral lesson. It was a lesson in humility, proving that the established way is not always the best way. It was a lesson in efficiency, demonstrating that true power lies not in brute consumption but in intelligent preservation. Mara's story is not just about surviving a blizzard. It is about the rediscovery of a fundamental truth, that nature, whether it is the physics of heat or the patterns of human behavior, does not yield to force. It yields to understanding. Master Borin tried to fight the cold with a bigger beast, and the beast consumed him. Mara invited the heat to stay, to pay its rent, and it became her steadfast, silent guardian. The cellar, a symbol of being buried and forgotten, became a womb of rebirth for the entire community. The knowledge that saved them was not forged in their moment of crisis, it had been there all along, patiently waiting for someone to be quiet enough to listen to the wisdom of the stones. The most profound revolutions are often the most silent, beginning not with a roar, but with a whisper from the past that finally finds a willing ear. So, what of the cellars in your own life, the forgotten spaces where old wisdom might be buried? What journals from your own grandfathers, literal or metaphorical, lie unread on a dusty shelf? We are all settlers in our own unforgiving wilderness, facing our own relentless winters. We spend our days chopping wood, feeding the roaring fires of our ambitions, our habits, our established ways of thinking. We believe in the spectacle, in the grand, visible effort. We measure our success by the size of the flames, by the sheer volume of fuel we consume, our time, our energy, our resources. We work harder, burn brighter, and create a mighty draft that pulls the cold realities of burnout, anxiety, and emptiness into the very rooms we are trying to warm. We scorch our faces with effort while our backs remain frozen with a quiet dissatisfaction. Are you standing too close to a fire that is consuming everything you give it and offering only fleeting, surface-level heat in return? Have you ever stopped to question the design of your own hearth? Mara's solution was not about finding more wood, it was about building a better stove. It was about fundamentally changing the system to work with principles rather than against them. It required humility to learn from the past, courage to defy conventional wisdom, and the patience to build something that did not offer instant, dramatic results but instead provided deep, lasting, and efficient warmth. Her triumph poses a question to us all. What is this white death you are bracing for? Is it a financial crisis, a personal challenge, a societal shift? And how are you preparing? By stockpiling more wood for the same wasteful fire, or by daring to build something new, something quieter, something based on a forgotten intelligence? Look around you. The plans for a better way are often hidden in plain sight, dismissed as foolishness by the master builders of the current moment. The knowledge you need may not be in the latest bestseller, but in the quiet counsel of an elder, the pages of a classic text, or the simple, observable laws of nature. What legacy knowledge have you cast out? What quiet, efficient truth are you ignoring in favor of a loud, dramatic, and ultimately draining falsehood? Your cellar is waiting, the vendor of your precious, finite moments. Will you keep selling them for a spectacular fire that leaves you cold, or will you invest them in building a system that offers enduring warmth long after the burning is done?